Hello! The goal of this video is to show new users of Xbase Forensics how to get a fully functioning copy of Xbase Forensics up and running, including all the optional modules. As you can tell, I have downloaded the archives that are available to all of our customers onto this system in order to be able to set up a new copy of Xbase Forensics from scratch. The archives are available separately, that is to say Xbase Forensics itself, as well as the additional archives for the additional components, in order to make it possible for customers to either have a particular version of Xbase Forensics mixed with a particular version of, say, the viewer libraries of their choosing, or to simply be able to opt out of having, say, the M-Player or the Tesseract components altogether. The simple solution to get a fully functioning copy of Xbase Forensics up and running is to simply create a directory of your choosing in a place of your choosing as well. In other words, there is no requirement for that directory to have a particular name or to be in a particular location. What I will then simply do is open and extract the contents of the zip file that is Xbase Forensics into that new directory of mine, and then add to that the contents of the individual other module archives. In other words, I can simply open up the M-Player, for example, and put the contents of that archive straight into the same directory as my Xbase Forensics copy. And I will repeat those steps. In other words, simply open up the archive, copy the entire contents and paste them into the Xbase Forensics directory for the viewer libraries, and then for the Tesseract as well, which is an optional component only since version 20.3 of Xbase Forensics. Tesseract will add the capability of doing OCR from within Xbase Forensics, but is not supported in versions of Xbase Forensics prior. So this is now the complete combination of Xbase Forensics as well as all the optional extras in the form of the viewer libraries, the M-Player and the Tesseract folders. And as you can see, the archives simply brought with them the necessary subdirectories, and therefore if I now run this copy of Xbase Forensics, you might notice I did not run setup, I did not go through any sort of installation process as such. I simply copied some directories from some archives, and then I run Xbase Forensics. The first time you run Xbase Forensics, you will be, after being shown the About screen with the license information and the exact version of Xbase Forensics, you will be prompted for some options. Most notably, you will be prompted for the paths. The paths for temporary files, the paths for images, and the paths for where your cases should be stored, at least as far as the defaults are concerned. All of these paths can be set here as a baseline for Xbase Forensics to use until further notice. But whenever you choose to create a case, your actual choice of storage location, of course, will still be open to you then. The same is true when images are created or when you choose to open and add them to a case of yours. As far as the temp files are concerned, you can either simply set once and for all the temp directory to be used by Xbase Forensics, or indeed, whenever you actually do create a case, you can set and choose the option for that case to actually have a case-specific temp directory for that particular case instead. That option will subsequently always be available to you whenever you set up a new case in the future. With your paths set as you actually desire them, in reality, of course, you know where you need these things to point, you can simply confirm and you would have a fully functioning working copy of Xbase Forensics at your disposal. In my case, I made sure to extract the viewer libraries, the M-Player and the Tesseract components directly into the Xbase Forensics directory itself, which means that if I go to Options Viewer Programs, where you will see the paths for these components are set up, none of these need changing or correcting because all of them work as they are. These paths are set up in such a way as to be functioning and correct as soon as all the components have been extracted into the Xways Forensics directory. Now, as you can tell in the top left-hand corner, for example, the separate viewer component is activated by that option, requiring this path, of course, to point to the correct location where the viewer libraries are to be found. Now, the path in this case is a dot, and the dot in Xways Forensics, as a rule, means the directory Xways Forensics itself is run from. Regardless of where that might actually be at this very moment, the path always refers to the actual directory Xways Forensics has been executed from. Now, in this case, you might think, and in previous versions of Xways Forensics that assumption would have actually been correct, that this should point to the viewer directory within the Xways Forensics directory. But there are two of those. The viewer directory, which is actually the 32-bit viewer, and the viewer directory inside the subdirectory x64, which would be the correct one to use for a 64-bit version of Xways Forensics. To make things simpler, and to facilitate easy switching between the 32 and the 64-bit versions of Xways Forensics, the path in this particular box is not, in fact, supposed to point to either of those directories, but to the directory into which the viewer directory has been extracted. In other words, the parent of the viewer directory. And this is, of course, in this case, the Xways Forensics directory itself, so the dot is entirely accurate. Should you have put your viewer component into a different location, you would have to change this path to point to the directory into which the viewer archive has been extracted. The same general idea also applies to the mplayer and the Tesseract paths. As you can tell, both of those begin with a dot, which in turn, of course, again correctly refers to the Xways Forensics directory into which I have actually extracted the mplayer and the Tesseract components. You do not technically require those if you do not intend to use the features they are used for. In the case of the mplayer, that is specifically the video still extraction, and in the case of Tesseract, of course, it's the OCR functionality offered in Xways Forensics since version 20.3. If you do intend to use those particular features, you obviously need to make sure that those paths are correct and actually contain the necessary components. The preferred video player, by the way, can of course be any video player of your choosing, but the mplayer path above must point at mplayer in order to use it for video still extraction. In my case, neither of these paths needs changing or amending. All of them are accurate because I extracted all of these archives into the Xways Forensics directory as it was meant. However, the dot, in other words, the relative path, allows for an interesting possibility. If you wanted to create a portable copy of Xways Forensics, in other words, if you wanted to put a copy of Xways Forensics onto a portable drive to then run Xways Forensics from that, you obviously would have to contend with the possibility that your portable drive is assigned a different drive letter on different systems, which in turn, of course, would make actual paths, that is, the kind with a drive letter at the beginning, difficult to use. However, relative paths are perfectly possible. What I could do is either use the dot or, in a slightly expanded version, a dot for one level up. So basically, if I had a copy of Xways Forensics and alongside that copy, that is not in it but next to it, I had a temp directory, I could change the path for temporary files to basically just say one level up and then temp. In a similar vein, I could make the images path go one level up /images and the cases path one level up /cases. Now, on your lab system, of course, you can use absolute paths because you presumably have very specific paths to set this to. But on a portable copy of Xways Forensics, these kinds of relative paths would ensure that the paths work regardless of what drive letter the drive might be assigned at any one point in time. Speaking of portability, you might also wish to make sure that when you click on the version number of Xways Forensics in the top right-hand corner of the product, you will see that the About screen at the bottom says generic portable configuration, which means this particular copy of Xways Forensics carries its settings within the same directory. The alternative, used whenever you are running an actually installed copy of Xbase Forensics in your program files folder, where settings for individual users cannot be held because different users on the system would presumably require their own settings. In that case, instead of saying generic portable configuration, this would point at the very path in your own user profile where your settings are actually held. For a shared installation of Xbase Forensics, the correct approach. For a portable installation of Xbase Forensics, of course, that would be a bad idea. So you would want to make sure that your copy is actually using its own portable configuration, especially if it is in fact on a portable drive. One path-related issue that some people also might at one point run into is in the options security, where the so-called strict drive letter protection, the first option on the top left-hand side, makes sure that Xbase Forensics will only write to locations that are known to be used actively anyway. In other words, the very drive letters on which either Xbase Forensics itself is running or any of the configured paths, in other words, the paths for temp, for cases, for images, any of those paths, or rather the drive letters they are pointing at, are deemed fair game. All other drive letters, for security reasons, in order to avoid accidentally writing to, say, for example, the system drive on a live drive being looked at by a portable copy of Xbase Forensics, all other drives are deemed off limits. Sometimes people run into this issue when they try to use features like recover copy, where, of course, you effectively choose to copy files from some subject item of investigation onto your own drive, and then you're basically being told you cannot use that destination. The strict drive letter protection, once disabled, will make all drive letters on your system fair game. The assumption, of course, being that if the drives are your own anyway, that's probably fine. So on a non-portable copy of Xbase Forensics, you might wish to uncheck this. In which case, in order to avoid this happening by accident, you actually have to confirm in writing that you intend to do this. And if I type in the word yes, my change of option is accepted. Two more quick notices that people might find useful when it comes to basic setup. Firstly, you might think at times that having to manually enter paths repeatedly, especially if you have previously configured other copies of Xbase Forensics to point at the same paths as the ones you choose to use now, you might find it useful that there is a load and save selections choice available by simply right-clicking the title bar of the individual settings dialogs. In other words, you can simply choose to save the selections in one configured copy of Xbase Forensics, and then in another one you could simply use load selections to load the previously saved file and thus end up transferring the settings in that particular dialog from one copy to another. The other thing you might find useful is to know that if you did want to completely reset the settings of a copy of Xbase Forensics, in other words, if you've decided that your changed options have gotten to the point where you'd rather go back to factory settings, you could always achieve that by going with help setup initialize, which not only will reset all the options back to factory settings, but of course also revert back to default paths. Though, to be fair, you could have the same effect by simply setting up a fresh copy of Xbase Forensics in a new directory.